This video is an offshoot from the video I made about Bloodborne. I realized partway through recording it that attempts to defend and talk up Dark Souls 2 were warming their way into the Bloodborne video, so instead of making the Bloodborne video even longer, I decided to cut those parts out and then put them in their own video. Then I realized this video made no sense because it was just a mishmash of stuff lifted from a different video pasted together without context, so I remade it all, which took bloody ages. This game is unfairly maligned. I think Dark Souls 1 was incredible, and people who really liked that one had kind of unrealistic expectations and got inevitably burned by the sequel being different or failing to be as spectacular and new as its predecessor when it came out. Judging it as a game, I think it's really good. It's not as good as Bloodborne, but it's a little bit it's a little bit better than Dark Souls 1. Oh, I mean, in me opinion, it's a little bit better than Dark Souls 1. Okay, it's about as good as Dark Souls 1, but it has some differences I prefer. Okay, it's not as good as Dark Souls 1, but the changes were an interesting and useful risk that's more valuable existing than not existing and is genuinely better than just getting more of Dark Souls 1, which we already have and you can still just go back to and play if you want to. And I personally think I had more fun with it. I think the Emerald Herald is a better waifu than Guinevere. We might as well start with a discussion of the health system, which I feel is the core building block of the Souls games because it dictates the Rifman structure of the gameplay and creates the weighty sense of challenge and difficulty the series is known for. Ironically, it's very easy to just make something hard. Making a game challenging while also being fun requires a very dense and carefully arranged interplay of mechanics. This is the tightrope games have to walk. How do you make a player feel challenged so that their success is a rewarding experience without making them feel overly punished or simply frustrated? This balance is difficult to execute. The reason Souls games are difficult in the first place is because of the way damage works in the games. If everything was the same, but all attacks did a half or a quarter the damage they do, the game would be fundamentally different, less challenging, and less fun as a result. Things wouldn't be as weighty because the damage wasn't as important and dodging wouldn't feel as necessary, and so on. This is why a lot of first-person shooters have a difficulty mode they explicitly recommend over the others because games usually manipulate difficulty by making the damage sliders be higher or lower and in most games there's a specific amount of damage attacks are most enjoyable to be working with. Souls games have no difficulty setting because there's almost no way to make the game easier without fundamentally altering the thing that makes the games fun. In a Souls game, you generally can only take a couple of hits before dying. Healing, therefore, is an important mechanic. How do you let the player gain health back? This is an important mechanic to talk about because it defines the flow of the rest of the ensuing game experience. Let's say there was no healing whatsoever, or you healed instantly without there even being an animation, or, as in Bloodborne, you could heal back damage you took if you retaliated quickly. These utterly change the rest of the mechanics and therefore the rest of the game experience because they change how the player is led to interact with them. The guy who gets to decide how players get health back actually is responsible for more of the game than the people who design the levels in a weird way. Souls games have done this a variety of ways with a variety of impacts on core gameplay. In Demon's Souls, you healed by using different kinds of grass you found or purchased. Stopping to grab a bite, however, was very slow and deliberate, and it stopped you dead in your tracks. While this is fine if you already beat the thing that damaged you, in a lot of direct combat situations, stopping to heal is either not going to work or is going to get you killed. It's a calculated risk every time, and in boss fights, finding places in the rhythm of the battle when healing was a good idea was key to survival for people who couldn't always avoid taking that damage. There is something of a downside to this, however. Firstly, while it is very calculated and purposeful and challenging to heal, should it be? It's fair, but is it good to be in a situation where the most pressing thing, trying to heal, is a really bad idea that would itself kill you? A lot of early players die while mashing the heal button. That's not fun, even if simply not doing that is technically the sound response. Secondly, in Demon's Souls, you immediately have access to all the healing items you will ever need. You can buy as many of them as you want as soon as the game properly starts and always go back for more, and they're fairly easy to farm from enemies. This means that if they master the timing to heal in battle, they're practically unkillable and can be worn down by attrition as they progress to a level. As long as no one encounter can fully drain your life bar, which can still happen a lot. Demon's Souls difficulty is reduced quite a bit from where it was probably meant to be. You technically have access to an infinite amount of life as long as you use it properly. Dark Souls replaced this health system entirely with the Estus Flask, a healing item which you couldn't buy more of. You had a limited amount of uses which recharged at bonfires or when you died. Yes, I know you can also get health back by using a humanity, but doing that burns such a rare resource that I couldn't really regard it as a source of healing unless you were one of those good at Dark Souls people I've heard so much about. This meant you had a finite amount of life at any given time. This also means attrition becomes a factor. Damage you take is health you are into getting back until you reach a place that restores Estus. This can make the game more interesting and more risky. It also means that there a net maximum amount of times you can possibly be hit by enemies or a boss in a single run. In this regard, Dark Souls is tremendously more difficult, but also more satisfying because of the new element of challenge it adds. However, you're still left basically prone while you do it, and it still takes just long enough that getting killed while trying to heal is an annoying and common possibility. And it means if you on a run to a boss and you take a certain amount of damage, you feel like you're already doomed on this run because there's no way you can get past them with that little health remaining, so you have to go back or just go on a doomed run and die and come back again. And that can kind of wear down your ability to keep playing the game and enjoy it, which is a big deal in games. Dark Souls 2, in my opinion, fixes some of this pretty well. Firstly, it takes an age to drink again, making it even more deliberate than the Demon's Souls 1, and your health actually recovers over a very short amount of time instead of instantaneously. This forces the player to not even consider healing until they're free and clear because there's no chance they'll just get the Estus to their lips before getting hit and stay alive. Ironically, by being even more slow and deliberate, it further disencourages the thing that causes annoyance when it doesn't work, dying while trying to heal. However, Dark Souls 2 also supplements this with life gems. Life gems are a little bit like the grass, down to being purchasable and coming in numerous sizes. They take a while to use, and they heal over time very slowly. This is genius. You see, attrition isn't necessarily a fun kind of challenge. It can create a nice feeling and a risk that you'll be worn down too far to make it anywhere, but you know what is fun? Knowing you're definitely fucked because you'll most likely lose the remaining health you have before you get anywhere new. Knowing you're At the limit your healing can possibly take you with your abilities, and you just not good enough, and you gonna have to keep playing this area over and over, or go farming and level up or something. By bringing back theoretically infinite health but making it heal very slowly, the creators have introduced a way to get around this annoyance without making the player feel totally invincible. They also have tactical uses. Since they take a while to use and are slow, they risky to use in fights, but if you good at not immediately dying, they still heal you, so you can run out of Estus and still have access to a source of healing that requires some skill to use effectively, which is kind of cool and smart. They also useful for if you expect to take damage, but don't think you will be able to stop and heal later. In some boss fights, using a gem when you get the chance and then attacking means you will get some health back even if you get hit a bit later. This is frankly a welcome addition. I've heard the criticism that the addition of life gems utterly destroys the delicate balance of the entire game, and it's erased the majesty of the Estus flask and its purposeful limitation of a player's maximum amount of mistakes. This, in a sense, is an accurate analysis. The balance is shifted. However, it's shifted in favor of the player in a way that's overall positive for the experience. Bloodborne probably does the best with its use of healing. With these use, heal to heal. Blood veils are simultaneously infinite and finite. You can buy a bunch quite easily, but only have 20 on hand at any time. The more you find in a level are immediately usable if you had less than 20 on you, so you can use more than 20 if you use one in a fight and then one drops from a corpse later, which happens fairly often. The healing is also quicker, and you have a lot of control over movement while you do it. This is good. I just talked about how good it was being made tactical the way it was in 2, but ultimately, as a mechanic, I think it's more enjoyable to be able to heal quickly because dying while healing, or dying because you were unable to heal, because tactically, if I was to grade all 4 games, healing methods, I would put Dark Souls last here because I don't personally think its method of attrition is all that fun when it comes down to it, and the precise amount of time it takes to heal and the way it immobilizes you makes it always a tantalizing risk you think you might just be able to make, which means more players trying to heal in this game than any other. I think Dark Souls 2 is the second best behind Bloodborne, and hey, that's pretty good. One criticism I see made a lot about Dark Souls 2 is that a lot of the bosses, and also a lot of enemies, are what amounts to humanoid people in armor. This isn't just an aesthetic complaint. It's also a problem in the sense that a lot of the fights with enemies amount to learning how they swing a weapon, how to get past their weapon, and which direction their swings go. And since there's a finite amount of ways a humanoid can swing a sword, it's possible to even start confusing enemies and their attacks for each other. A lot of bosses are very similar, unlike the previous game, which has more of a variety of unique bosses like the Gaping Dragon or Nito or Seath the Scaleless, breaking up the monotony. And indeed, there are quite a lot of humanoid opponents who fight with swords in what amounts to a duel. But here's the thing. I'm gonna make a different argument here. I'm not gonna argue that the bosses are all sufficiently different, which in my opinion they are, or that there are plenty of different kinds of boss fight breaking up the monotony, which there is, but instead I'm going to play the wild card and be the needless contrarian that people say, way. I'm gonna argue in favor of dudes in armor. I think the best kinds of fight in games are against enemies on roughly equal footing with the player. All games, not just Souls games. There's something viscerally satisfying about facing off with someone making use of the same skill set as you. The best boss fights in Devil May Cry are the fights against Virgil or Dant, or another human-sized opponent with another ridiculous sword. The best boss fight in God Hand and also gaming history is against Azal, who has the devil hand, and so on. It's far more compelling to fight a person making use of skills you yourself could be using than someone with far more powers than you or who is an incomprehensible mess. It feels good, to put it simply. Dark Souls had a couple of regular enemies in the game who scratched this itch form, like, the Imp Invasions, like Manny to Mildred, Lautrec, the crestfallen guy when he goes hollow, or Oscar when you return to the asylum, or Rickard. These kinds of fight are the best and most memorable. In fact, I just remember those offhand. I didn't even put those in the script. I just decided to list them because I just know them all. Pfft is so fun in these games for this exact reason. You refighting people on the same footing as you with access to the same resources. It's just great. It's a puzzle where you all pick your poison and then you fight to see who is poisoned the most. But in Dark Souls, the only boss fight that comes really close to getting this right is Artorias in the Dock. Ornstein and some kind of did it, but you were too busy dealing with the other guy, so you could never really focus on the aspect of the fight that's like this straightforward, cool duel, you know. And then they get really big, and then it becomes a very different kind of thing. Artorias is a really, really good fight. He's not exactly on equal footing with you. He's presented as a very strong person, larger than life, literally corrupted by evil, but he's a brilliant fight because he never comes off as ridiculous. He even dodges and rolls the way a person would. You get this fantastic mix of outsmarting a fellow consciousness trying to beat you in a straight fight. Before Dark Souls 2, I would describe Knight Artorias as the platonic ideal of a Dark Souls boss fight. It's the most pared down, purified form of single combat with another swordsman in the Souls games, and that's really, the best thing. Dark Souls 2 has a lot more of this kind of fight than the previous two games, and more than Bloodborne also. And this, I must stress this is my opinion, is a gift. The Pursuer, the Lost Sinner, the Looking Glass Knight, Velstead, and in the Dulks, the Few Knight and Sir Valon, and the Burnt Ivory King. In my opinion, these fights are what the Souls games mechanics are vessels for. This is what the game should be built around. There's even the old Dragon Slayer, a version of the Ornstein and Smurfs fight that indulges in this aspect more than fighting two people at once could do. I remember telling me friends that I'd wished there'd been a one-on-one fight with a character like Ornstein, perhaps as a mini-boss later on, and those friends played this 3 version of 2 while I waited for it to come out on taps. The first thing they did when it came out was tell me where to go for a cool surprise over Skype, and I got the fight I'd wanted from the previous game. I'm sure people complained that this was a needless rehash or fan pandering, but it was literally a fight I specifically thought would have been fun and missed not having, and I'm glad someone working on Dark Souls 2 agreed with me. Honestly, when I saw early critics saying, Dark Souls 2 is pretty great, but you fight a lot of dudes in armor, I remember immediately thinking, hell, yes. There are other kinds of fight, and it's good to have them, but they are the best. Perhaps one of the worst things about Demon's Souls and Dark Souls is they didn't properly master this idea yet. Demon's Souls had the Penetrator, Dant, Hlath, and some decent fights like Garl Vinland, the actual final boss of the Valley of Defilement. I mentioned the wounds Dark Souls had but too elevated these fights to their proper place as the core kind of fight you did the most, and I love it for that. The Hyde Knights are criminally underrated. They deliberately look and fight very differently from the Black Knights of Dark Souls 1, and if you let them get up, which you should do, because why else are you attacking them? They sit down and do nothing on purpose until you want to fight them. The fight is usually pretty cool. They kill me a lot, so I can't show me beating them here really easily, which would have been nice footage to have. But, which would will The narrative critics create when they talk about dudes in armor is that the developers ran out of ideas, but with just a slight change in perspective, it becomes clear that the developers had a really good new idea, which was to use more of a kind of fight that was vastly underutilized in previous games and worked really well. Does that really count as a new idea? Yeah, sure. Well, I'm gonna claim it is, at least, and you can't stop me. It's a fundamental change in the makeup of the game, and in me opinion, it's for the better. That's not to say that's the only kind of boss fight. Though, like in Dark Souls, there are plenty of different kinds of fight breaking up the monotony against bigger bosses like the Last Giant. Oh, there's unique, one-of-a-kind fights like the one with Scorpionus Nagica, who visually resembles Quillag but is a very different kind of fight, but there's all kinds. There's the Royal Rat Vanguard, there's the Congregation, there's the Covetous Demon, there's, oh, Mr. Chariot, and there, the Dark Lurker if you couldn't be bothered to go do all the stuff that you need to do to fight him, which I couldn't. So I didn't get any footage of it. I've also heard the criticism that there are too many bosses that consist of fights with large groups, and this is proof of the game's poor design. Similar problems extend to other boss fights, which seem to follow the mantra, if you can't make it good, make it difficult by adding more stuff. This is matthewmatosis. His Dark Souls 2 critical video came out just over a month after the release of the game in April 2014. It blew up somewhat on the internet, to the point that a lot of the times I see someone in person or online talking about Dark Souls 2, they are often using criticisms that can be heard in this video, and many who don't like the game will cite. In fact, when asking viewers for criticisms that they would want to see me respond to, the bulk of them linked this video, and most of the people that did so because they knew for certain I would have already seen this one by now. We were dealing with a piece of criticism that had, in its own way, quite a fundamental impact on discourse surrounding the game. The arguments got copied, repeated, referenced, and in many ways, I think, the prevailing dismissive attitudes towards the game's quality started to crystallize as a result of this video. That's not to say the video is literally to blame for negativity towards Dark Souls 2, but regardless, it is necessary that this critic be defeated and destroyed at all costs. The mechanics of the Souls games are built for one-on-one engagements thanks to its slow attack animations which are uninterruptible once they start, and a lock on camera which focuses heavily on a single foe. This early criticism is an interesting one. The claim is that adding more enemies into the game and also into some boss fights is a lazy attempt to increase difficulty, and that this is bad because Souls games are specifically designed to work best against single enemy encounters. Matthewmatosis is entitled to his opinion, and I respect that, but here's why this is a lie. There are absolutely ways of dealing with larger numbers of crowds. It just requires different behavior than how you normally deal with enemies when there's just one or two. Crowd control is a different skill than the one that you normally required to test, but it's on that's worth testing and really isn't in previous games. I remember God Hand being criticized for having too many enemies for an engine that was claimed to only really work best in one-on-one fights. But you can look up people playing it and see there's plenty of crowd control, but not if you always play the way you do against just one opponent at a time. Play the player, 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 where, wanna, player, I review, player, there. You, Take the Prowling Magus fight, for example. If you want to kill one of the crawling undead littering this fight, your rays need to be taken off the casters at the back in order to lock on. As you see, here's your problem. Matthew makes the supposedly obvious criticism that locking on makes it hard to see your enemy, so the fight isn't well designed, or fights against groups are inherently bad in this type of game or something. But why would you lock on? You see, the Dark Souls series has this amazing feature where, using the right stick, you can rotate the camera to show anything you want on the screen. You can manually control the camera yourself. When you think about it, his argument actually is that the lock-on system works best against single enemies, and he's right about that, but that's why you don't lock on in a fight against multiple enemies. Arguably, the main lesson you retaught as early on as the first real areas is that enemies are attacking from all over the place, and you ought to keep your wits about you more than just pressing the button that focuses on one person and hoping for the best. This is a game that prides itself on expecting you to look where you're going, even as far back as the first game with the guy hiding behind the doorway and people hiding in corners, even all the way over in Bloodborne. And by say, by this, by The lock-on system is a tool to be utilized carefully, just like every other ability and mechanic. Matt found the lock-on function was bad in this scenario and concluded that it was a flaw with the game. The challenge in this boss fight, like with the rats, is to avoid getting swarmed and put into a bad situation to keep track of yourself and navigate carefully. If you locked directly onto one of the enemies, you would have a problem, and that means you don't do that. Dark Souls uses fights like this and a generally different sort of level design to teach you that in this world, sometimes focusing down on a specific individual is a mistake. Matthew didn't like Dark Souls as much because he didn't to learn this lesson and kept trying to play it the exact way he played the previous two. He also invokes the time you fight against the two dragon riders, and there's a cute little clip I want to show where he locks onto one and then has to angle himself precisely so he can see the two of them. The twin dragon riders are another example of this. You want to avoid attacks from both of them while periodically damaging one of them, but in order to do so, you need to lock onto one and position yourself in such a way so you can see the other. This clip is meant to show how bad the lock-on system is in two-person fights and therefore how poorly designed this fight is for putting this guy all the way over there. But the thing is, you could just not hit the lock-on button. You could just not do that. You can aim the camera wherever you want. You can still dodge and attack. You know, I looked back over the footage of me doing this fight and I didn't clock on at all until one of them was dead and it became a good idea to completely focus on one enemy. This naturally occurred to me because this is how Dark Souls 2 teaches you to play. I honestly think the mechanics and the way they were utilized in the first two games has gotten so ingrained in people who like those two that it makes them play weirdly in games that work slightly differently or have different kinds of challenge, and this strikes them as a flaw. I got some criticism on me last video that it's wrong to say it's possible to play a game wrong, and there a lot of ways of playing Dark Souls and they are all equally valid if that's how the player wants to do it, and yeah, kinda. But all I can say is I can definitely see why matthewmatosis and other critics had a less good time with Dark Souls 2 if this is how they approach. This looks a whole lot like playing the game wrong and blaming the game for it. I still do really bad in this fight, though. Notice yourself. Just cut away from this quicker in the final edit. Also, we need to edit out the part where I say this. Please. Matthew is still trying to use the lock-on mechanic in fights even as late as the Watcher and Defender bosses, and he's still using a shield. Aw, bless. Someone really liked the previous games and tried real hard not to unlearn what they learned there. This kind of criticism sheds light on the critical perspective that approached the game in the first place. Players who went into the game expecting it to be exactly like the previous ones inevitably did badly in these sections and seemingly blamed the game for it. Joseph Anderson, a critic who put out 3 videos about Dark Souls in late 2015 and was much less negative about the game, similarly doesn't use the lock-on feature in many of the fights he shows in his video, and like me, he fought most of them without using a shield either. In the same manner that shields are fine, but not if they engender passivity, the lock-on system is a great mechanic that can accidentally engender a reliance upon it. Also, Monster Hunter, a series many regard as very similar in a lot of ways, has basically no lock-on functionality whatsoever, and the subhuman criminals who love Monster Hunter seem to do just fine using it to see the enemies however they want. That's not to say Monster Hunter wouldn't benefit from having one, but if it did have one, it would probably be something to use sparingly, much like in Dark Souls 2. Also, it's worth remembering that this type of boss has been present in Souls games for a long time. You might remember, I don't know, the Phalanx, the first real boss in Demon's Souls. It's a fight about balancing the interplay between the actual opponent and the numerous creatures that break off from it and act independently, threatening to surround and overwhelm you. Then, right after, there's the Tower of Night boss fight. Geez, the first 2 bosses in the first game in the series and both of the muse mechanics matthewmatosis concluded are inherently antithetical to the core of the Souls games. What? Did the developers not realize how their game worked? If I look onto the archer, I can't see the Tower of Night unless I stand here. I can't use the function designed for focusing on one person and see everyone else. What? Did the team design this game? Static attacks also lock onto an unnecessary degree. When a boss goes to do an overhead attack, it will usually track the player up until the very last moment before impact. When matthewmatosis makes this comment, in order to make an example of a superior fight, he cuts to footage of the Adjudicator, the least memorable fight in the entire Souls series. I forget the Adjudicator exists every time I play Demon's Souls without fail, and then I go, oh yeah, this guy, eh? And I kill him on the first tree and forget about him again. His attacks go for where you used to be 10 minutes ago. No aspect of this boss should be the model for how fights should work in Souls games. The simple fact is that in previous entries in the series, circle strafing enemies has been an easy way to cheese a lot of the game. Circle strafe the simp because the enemies focus in on you more. Guess what? You actually have to dodge some of their attacks now, using timing and knowledge of the right direction to move based on judging how the enemy's moving. A lot of the fights Mr. Matosis, if that is his real name, uses to make examples of this apparent horrific problem actually show him mistiming a dodge, or dodging in the direction of the swing. I don't think this demonstrates what he thinks it's demonstrating. Bosses all over the series lock right onto you as their attack goes off. This happens because on some level, the game is about learning how and when to dodge instead of just spinning a circle around someone so they can never hit you. The amount of lock on enemies have in this game is only a problem if you don't know how to dodge attacks. I honestly think this footage speaks for itself. Here we are getting into the bedrock of some fundamental differences in the way Dark Souls 2 is made and what it achieves versus the previous game's decisions, both in terms of gameplay and in terms of storytelling. Dark Souls is commonly lauded for being one large interconnected world. I criticized this perception a little in the Bloodborne video, and because I'm a hack, I'm gonna rehash that here. Dark Souls interconnectedness is fun and creates an interesting sense of being in a real place, and it's cool you can find yourself in a real world and creates an interesting sense of being in a real place, and it's cool you can find ways of getting from one place to another and nice little shortcuts, but it also weakens the game in a lot of ways. Okay, I know that's contentious. I'm not stupid. Hear me out here. It's technically a good thing that the areas lead across and into each other so much. Blighttown, for example, is made more interesting by the fact it connects both the depths and the Valley of Drakes and the Great Hollow, and it leads to Quilag's domain and later is used to access the Demon Ruins. However, let's think for a moment about level design and encounter design. When you redesigning a world that can be traversed across to all these different places or even simply back and forth. In this case, climbing out of Blighttown once you first kill Quillag. You redesigning a level that makes promises to be usable in all these ways at once. No enemy encounter can be designed to play really well in one direction because you aren't, and encounters all have to compensate for the fact you're gonna be coming back through it the other way. In fact, at a certain point, it becomes clear the developers realized they'd forgotten to fully compensate for this. The blow dart guys who inflict toxic on you are basically unavoidable if you retrying to get out because of the inevitable ladder climbing you have to do. So they made them not respawn, so you only ever have to kill them once, and therefore, on your way back out, you probably don't have to deal with them at all because you killed them all. But this also severely compromises the challenge of going down because it means each blow dart guy only ever has to be dealt with once. You can basically just run to them, de-killing them, and then carry on in a now much easier area. By having to account for the fact you're gonna have to come back the other way, the fun and challenge of going through it either way is hamstrung. This is not great design. You can even see a more ideal version of Blighttown in Anor Londo. You can only ever fight these enemies this one way, and that means this one way's really interesting. And this is believe the very breasting. They say you know, this section's great. There's no way to come back the way you came, but there's also no reason to because once Anor Londo is beaten, you unlock the ability to warp between bonfires, seemingly an acknowledgement that this area makes no sense going through it backwards to get out. Plus, at this point in the game, The developers had definitely realized that running back and forth between areas is actually really tedious. But because warping wasn't really fully fleshed out in Dark Souls 1, there's an awful lot of needless walking. Walking back to bonfires you already lit but can't warp to, walking through long paths, or walking through still long but slightly shorter paths because this one's technically a shortcut, and then you have to do it again. It's not good. It's not the best it could be. I just want to fight Artorias again. It's a cool fight, but they're like 5 minutes of walking every single time, even with this shortcut. And guess what? If you didn't find the bonfire at the Daughter of Chaos, which, by the way, why would you? Because it's a secret hidden behind an illusionary wall. There's no nearby warpable bonfire for beating the demon ruins. So, when it's time to go do that bit, guess what? It's time to go all the way back through Blighttown again. Yay. Blighttown was so busy leading down into Quilag's domain and the demon ruins and the Great Hollow, leading across into the Valley of Drakes, and leading up into the depths and its own arse, that it forgot to have particularly good gameplay or to have any frames. Hey, check it out. I didn't even need to invoke Dark Souls 2 to explain why Dark Souls 1's interconnectedness is bad in a lot of cases, but I guess I should since talking about Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 2's version of Blighttown, the gutter, is way better designed because it's built to be journeyed through once in one direction. Once you're in the gutter, it's literally impossible to climb out. Actually, you would have to warp, which you can now mercifully do at the beginning of the game and between any bonfire. It's almost like this game was designed to be played by people who don't want to fucking run around in circles for hours, which is an improvement, I would say, personally. There's a lot of sheer drops and daring leaps. The enemies can be designed purely for this one direction and no other bullshit. Like the beetles, which one direction are better than. Enemies only stop respawning if you've killed them so many times. It's clear they're not really a problem for you and you just need to get back to later bits instead of immediately never respawning ever again because the developers knew they were a bit rubbish. The treatment of these areas in particular is emblematic. I love that word of the game's overall approaches to design, and I'm not gonna tell you which one is better, but it's obvious. So far, I've only talked about world design in terms of the ensuing level design, but that's not the only thing impacted by that. There's also an aesthetic component, and this, I think, is an aspect that most exemplifies the difference in concerns and goals between the first two Dark Souls games in particular. Dark Souls 1's world has, let's call it, a physical coherency to it. If you were standing in a high place and look in a direction, you will see a place you end up going later in the game. The world of Lordran feels like a physically consistent, objective world. Here, a 3D model of the Dark Souls' own world. Apart from a few very clearly separated sections, it all physically ties together, which is pretty cool. Meanwhile, in Dark Souls 2, this is far from the case. Plenty of places don't take visual sense. You can get to the top of a tower you physically see in the distance and you can see how tall it is, but then at the tippy top, you find an elevator and it takes you further up into nowhere and you emerge in a lava land that couldn't possibly exist. Theoretically, you could dig a deep enough hole in the ground and all the lava would just flow out into the world below and kill everyone. Remember the compiled 3D model of Dark Souls 1. Here's the model for Dark Souls. Basabzabza, Pleasant, Fissavy, Plier, 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 Booze, Booze, Sesavy, Theovu, Pegu, Pissavu, Fizivu, Pissu, Pissavu, Pegu, 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 Fivu, Pegu, Pissavu, Pegu, Pivuvu, Pissavu, Tivu, Pissavu, Pivu, Pizivu, Viu, Pivu, Bavavu, Pissavu, Bavavu, Pivu, 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 This is true. Many critics then go on to say that this makes it worse than Dark Souls, which was nonlinear. This is treason, and I'll see you in hell. As we just established, Dark Souls is interconnected. It is not nonlinear. This is not semantics. This is a big deal. I swear to God. You have clear-cut objectives that you have to complete in a set order. You can technically kill Quillag first before the bell gargoyles. You can also ignore the depths if you want to. But you have to kill these two bosses. You have to ring two bells. You have to do Sense Fortress. And then you do at Orlando. And then you have to collect 4 Lord Souls to progress, which you can do in any order if you want. But you have to do all of them. This isn't nonlinear. This is a choice of which linear path you take first. This sense of linearity is disguised by the interconnectedness and the sense of having to run back and forth through a world because the warps weren't fully fleshed out. But that's not nonlinearity. That's actually kind of bad design. Oh, masking linearity. At least in Dark Souls II, you don't technically need to beat all 4 main bosses to unlock the entrance to Drangleic. You can just get a lot of souls. That's actually way more of an alternative than any part of Dark Souls I. For a hugely entertaining comparison, check out the 2-act speedruns of the 2 games. Oh, I started with a master key so it can kill the 2 bosses I have no choice but to kill in a slightly different order if I want to, but I'm not going to because it turns out the intended way was faster anyway. Fuck you. I used bonfire aesthetics to kill the rotten 4 times and to skip 3/4 off the main fucking game. See you in shit, Dark Souls. Also, not only could Dark Souls have easily been less linear if it wanted to, the game fucking contrives itself to ensure that it isn't with needless bullshit. Do you want to beat Seath the Skeletalist before putting the Lord Vessel on the thing? Nice tree, idiot. Impassable magic fog. Oh, you just beat Quillag. I want to see what's going on in the obvious path past her that it makes sense to go down instead of climbing all the way back out immediately. Well, fuck you. We put some fucking mist here because we arbitrarily decided you done to get to do this stuff. You got to do the other things first. See you in 10 to 15 hours, you worthless pisshound. Do you want to see what Nito's up to? Tune in next time when go fuck yourself, idiot. Do you want to kill the 4 kings before doing anything else? Well, guess what? You can. You can get their Lord Soul first thing if you want to. You just need Artorias' ring from Sith. Oh my goodness. There's so much freedom in these games. A similar mechanic is used in Dark Souls, but it's with doors that are off the beaten path, do not block the most obvious form of progress, and you might even forget about them until you get the king's ring and realize that's the symbol of the king they were talking about. And it's like you figured out a mystery and you get to watch an ancient fantasy door slowly unlock when you put it on. I like ancient fantasy doors. They really real thing that I am into. That sounds really weird, but I mean that. Cool doors. I like a cool door. Cool. Shut up. They re nice. It's a nice door. On top of all of that, Dark Souls I has a very different kind of design overall, with an enhanced focus on player freedom in the actual fights, which are the things that you spend most of the time doing in these games. Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 1's encounters are, in a sense, kind of restrictive. Each area and encounter, by which I mean distinguishable fight between a group in the game, exists to test the player in some specific way. The Tower Knight exists to test how you deal with an encounter with one big slow enemy supplemented by a multitude of ranged attackers. The player can use any items they have at their disposal to deal with this magic. Swords, shields, items, or what have you, but crucially, the same skill is being tested no matter what, namely how you deal with this one situation. So no matter what your loadout was, axe, big sword, daggers, magic, arrows, you either dodging a ridiculous amount of arrows to fight this guy, or more likely taking out all the archers one by one with whatever you happen to have on you and then engaging the knight on his own. The archers on the walls of an Orlando exist to test how you deal with walking down a straight path with attacks that can easily knock you off. No matter what sort of character you are, the same thing is being tested no matter what, and you have to employ the same skills to get past it no matter what. You literally walking a straight, linear path. A lot of the first two Souls games are based on putting you in a specific place, then throwing a specific thing at you and making you deal with it the way they want you to do. In Sen's Fortress, you walking between the same sets of traps and negotiating the same fortress in the same way no matter what character you built. In all of these examples, the focus is on an enclosed space, so you can be forced into dealing with the scenario the developers want you to engage with. Ironically, despite being supposedly way more linear, Dark Souls 2 is generally designed in a much more free, open way in regards to its encounters. Encounters take place in a much wider open area with a focus on having more space to navigate as you see fit. Parogs on play. In this room there are several knights. The knights are very difficult to face as a bunched up group, but if you want, you can lead them out onto the battlements where they are vulnerable to attack all at once. However, there's a risk of falling off and there's a guy in the distance shooting arrows at you. The player is encouraged to know where they want to fight and make decisions about how to engage in the combat beyond. This approach generally extends throughout the rest of the game. This increases player freedom by letting them decide precisely how and where to pitch their battles, and mobility and positioning become much more important aspects of the game. Combat is much more free-form as a result. Archers in the previous games are, let's call it, forceful. They put there, and you have no choice but to deal with them. They were usually supplementing a different enemy, so you either have to deal with them while the archers are shooting at you, or you have to take time out before that fight just to deal with the archers before resuming it unhindered. And if you do, you have to take the time out to deal with the archers yet again, along with walking all the way back through a gauntlet of enemies, which in these games always respawn. God, that sounds like fun, doesn't it? I wonder why, statistically, so many people stop playing here. I wonder. Maybe it's the player's fault. Ranged attackers in Dark Souls are tremendously less annoying. Take, for example, the ones in the encounter I already described. The player has the option of engaging the enemy in places the archer can't attack you at all, but fighting in that area has its own particular trade-offs. The player gets to decide how to deal with the archers instead of basically having no choice but to continuously dodge them because this is the place this fight is supposed to happen, or painstakingly take them out every time you want to do the fight. There's archers and other kinds of ranged attackers in the Forest of Fallen Giants, but there's now room to maneuver and move your enemies away from their range into different areas with different characteristics. Like I said, you get to choose how and where to have these fights. The open space is better for the clump of enemies, but you have to worry about the archer, or you can go for the ranged attackers first and take the risk of being overwhelmed or caught out, but then fight them free from that problem. You can't chase after the archers here, but they all follow you up the ladder, and that all create a gauntlet, which you then have to avoid by jumping down or cutting through them. This fight can play out a lot of different ways based on how. Whereas in the previous games it's mostly just you have to do this thing first till you all do and then you dodge. Often people have criticized this game for having multitudes more enemies to fight at once, and this is an artificial inflation of difficulty. But the thing is, because of Dark Souls 2's vastly different kind of level design, this is simply a different kind of challenge provided to the player than the previous ones, and it's not an insurmountable one. The challenge in areas with tons of dudes is in how you deal with tons of dudes at once. If you re out of position, you all get displaced and destroyed by the swarm. Videos critical of the amount of enemies in Dark Souls 2 will often show you contextless footage of their character surrounded and being ganked to death, and look how unfair this is, but what they re-showing takes place after the point where they already messed up by letting themselves get utterly surrounded like this in the first place. The previous games rarely make your strategy when it comes to relative positioning as crucial as Dark Souls 2, but there are a couple. My fave is this bridge in Demon's Souls. Once you stand here, see the guys blocking the end, and turn around and realize every enemy you failed to kill on the way here is now funneling down the other end, you re-struck with the beautifully tense realization that if you don to do something now, you already dead. But many of the main areas and boss fights in Dark Souls to draw this aspect into critical focus and in a much more freeform way, where instead of simply being trapped in a small area, you in a large area and have to deal with a group that's actively threatening to surround you. Instead of the passive challenge of a physical choke point, the fight is a reactive challenge in the form of a moving set of enemies that can easily form a choke point with their own movements, which you can then deal with however you like. Fights against groups can play out totally differently based on how you fight in them, and that's just really cool. When a friend was playing through Dark Souls on and asking for help, I would just tell them literally the thing they were meant to do to get past that area, because usually there was one main way, and if you didn't to know what it was, it would kill you. In Dark Souls 2, the same friend never had to ask for advice because they were free to figure it out. There were other ways through based on what things they had with them and how they wanted to do that fight. It was a lot more interesting for players who aren't already mega fans of the first Dark Souls game and what it specifically did with fights. I think people who want to be critical of Dark Souls 2 can look at the amount of enemies and go, ah, they just threw more in, but the entire design of the game is almost fundamentally different in so many ways that I really don't feel like that's an accurate comparison. The Shrine of Amarna has a ton of magic users, but they in an area where firing back at them is finally doable, unlike the archers in the Tower Knight fight or the Demon fight, and you can use magic or arrows based on what you have with you. Dodging them is trivial because you can see the attacks coming far more than a bunch of tinny arrows. And there's plenty of cover you can utilize in various different ways so you can fight enemies while not in the way of magic if you want to. The final run to the boss is famously very tough, but this is a fairly late game area in a Dark Souls game. It being hard is kind of the thing that you paid to do. Also, I just summoned for it. It's okay. I don't have a problem with it. They usually do during the fight, and that makes it interesting because it's like you take casualties and then you carry on. I like it. I like summoning in these games. There's a bunch of purists out there who are like, I never summon for any fights because I want to be the best. I want to handle them all. I mean, sure. Good for you. I am sure it feels tremendously good, and it must be really annoying that there are fights that you really, really should summon for, but I like having friends who join me and do stuff. I like that. Speaking of having friends, Dark Souls 2 lets you have friends. There are even rings your character can wear that mean it's really easy to single out exactly who you want to summon. You can have friends in Dark Souls now. The network isn't going to melt down. You're not going to have to install a bunch of third-party mods and hope that makes it work. The game works now, guys. I don't want to be seen to be dismissive and just say people who deal a lot in group encounters are just bad at it and their criticism is false. That would be really stupid to just say out loud like that. So instead, I said it over 10 minutes. Some of you might be familiar with me video about Bloodborne. It kinda revolutionized the face of game design for all time. Just kidding. But it did kind of invent a newish concept. At least I think it does. I haven't heard anyone else using it before, called play conditioning, which refers to the way a game leads you to play it with the execution of its mechanics. When a game kills you very easily, tells you to prepare to die, and hands you a shield, and teaches you how to use it, you retaught specific rules about that game's world and it sticks with you. The rest of the game experience could have been better served by a different early approach, but you've been quite definitively taught a specific one and it'll probably be a struggle to unlearn it. I brought this up in the video to make the point that Bloodborne quite deftly pushes the player into a more frenetic direction, with a few subtle changes to its base mechanics and much wider-reaching executions of those mechanics. There is still one or maybe two shields in the game, but you don't find them for so long that you learned not to use them. They exist almost to show you that you never really need the shield engendered passivity. That wording's actually kind of genius. The game's own item description directly blames shields themselves, not players, for not realizing how they were supposed to use them. I think that's really clever and also an honest admission that they kind of messed up in Dark Souls 1. Some folks disagreed with me comments that playing with a shield was an inherently wrong, slow, overly defensive, or boring way to play, and I do have to stress that's just me opinion. You can play the games however you want. I am just describing how the game is most fun, in me opinion, and the ways I think the game leads people to play in those more fun ways than the previous ones. While Bloodborne is undisputedly the master of this, Dark Souls 2 does a lot of really great things with play conditioning also, things that other critics dismiss as minor tweaks or just don't talk about at all. In the Bloodborne video, my central example was the shield, and we might as well start there too because people don't fucking mention this. Dark Souls 2 has shields. It has plenty of them, and they refine. They work well, and you can get some very defensive ones that do all the stuff you need, and you can buff them lots of different ways too, but here's the thing. Only one class starts with a shield at all in Dark Souls 2. In fact, that class, the warrior, begins life with a broken sword. Every other character starts with some semblance of a fighting setup. The knight has a broadsword, the swordsman has 2+1 swords, the bandit has an axe and a bow, and so on. Starting with a shield handicaps you in many ways at the start of this game. It forces you to use ingenuity to get access to a weapon that's more viable. It's not even that great a shield. Other classes having no shield are forced to use dodging or parrying or make good use of what they were given. Whoa, way, way, whoa. Wow, This is tiny, simple change to just starting loadouts, but it's fantastic design. It alters the shape of the entire game experience. You re-expected, told Even, to make use of the engine in a vastly different way from how you re-led to think you re-supposed to play the first game. Shields you acquire early on don't even block 100 of damage, and you don't have much life, so blocking is treated as a last resort for if you really don't know what else to do about an attack or haven't learned its timing yet. Dark Souls 2 is the first game in the series where you started getting players who were more casually walking around without a shield at all, preferring two-handing or the new power stance added for dual-wielding characters. By the time you reach shields that actually block lots of damage, the way early shields did in the first game, you've employed a level of skill getting to them that means using them would be a waste of a good hand you could be keeping another weapon in or some magic. Dodging like this would have seemed like a needless, risky waste of time to the old me if I had a shield and could block the damage perfectly well, but it would have been so slow. You don't need Dark Souls 2 to teach you to play this way, obviously. You can figure it out if you do a lot of practicing or look up a lot of YouTube videos or dope or whatever, but being forced to play that way by the game makes you learn it so much faster. Other touches can be seen here, too, like parrying. In Dark Souls 1, parrying offered a brief, clumsy moment to get in a riposte. Oh, and you can't even do a riposte if you two-handing in Dark Souls 1. Thanks, fuckers. The sound effect was satisfying but hard to make out if anything else was happening. The window to respond was short, and the animations that played where enemies were parried were often really short and vague. I didn't parry a lot in Dark Souls 1 because, frankly, I didn't trust the game enough to let me capitalize on it. In Dark Souls 2, parrying triggers a loud, ultra-cool sound. The enemies fall down in a protracted dear God my entire world is ending animation and stay there for ages while they wait for you to capitalize. This is, in a word, encouraging. You feel like you've made a decisive move and might even have already won. You feel rewarded for learning how an enemy attacks. It's obvious you've pulled it off and you have plenty of time to react to knowing you've done it. I felt, like I said, encouraged to keep parrying. Instead of abandoning it after the early levels, I only really using it on heavily choreographed enemies like I did in 1. Parrying really only came into its own in Bloodborne, which handed you a weapon specifically for doing it and made even monstrous enemies parryable, but this represents a step in the right direction. I realized, playing Dark Souls 2, that the reason it seemed too hard to get to the level of skill other people were displaying was because getting there required lots of time investment and practice to get around the fact the game itself did a pretty bad job of getting you there by itself. The phrase, "get good," has been around for ages but was massively popularized in the Souls community, and this is because the gulf of skill is so wide between new and experienced players that it's almost impossible to help someone get on their level, the only advice being basically to keep playing until they become good at the game. No matter how you look at it, the fact the community has trouble introducing the game it's built around to new players constitutes something of a problem, and this is a problem I feel Dark Souls 2 solves with some very careful changes in its design. I said before that I thought Dark Souls was incredible, but I owe that Toadstool showing me the way to appreciate it properly and the way to approach it in a way that was actually really fun. The blueprint for Bloodborne, the bloodprint, if you will, of a lot of creative decisions, lies in Dark Souls 2. I am unsure if it directly inspired the attitudes to shields and healing and level design and so on in Bloodborne, but even if it did, the way Bloodborne seemingly builds on these ideas for me shows that 2 was a step in the right direction even if it did, to get everything right. Dark Souls own is, on a technical level, interesting and complex. The opening cinematic explains the setup of the world of the story. Gwyn and company mess up the ancient dragons, build a society using the power of the soul, and people start becoming undead and going mad, and the empire eventually collapses when the flames start to go out and Gwyn fucks up trying to fix it. But what the player actually does is run around a mostly empty world killing the people who remain so they can open a big door. There isn't much actual interaction with this story. The stuff about everlasting dragons and a war to kill them all doesn't really have much of an impact on the story of the player killing the people who killed them and nicking their souls. What the first game excels at is lore, in the sense that through item descriptions and chance encounters with the people who remain in the world and are safe to talk to, you can learn little tidbits about them as people. You can run into a character, have a brief conversation, and be sure that if you pay attention to the world and objects related to them or their people, you will learn something about them and their culture. The closest you get to a story is a guy saying, "Ring some bells." There's an old saying in my family, "Fuck your family." This is the reason for the whole mission. Like, you meet this guy who's like, my family have this fucked up stupid belief. You meet this fucked up belief. You will be away my you be Or another guy saying, ring some bells. Or a serpent saying, hey, Gwen was cool. Kill his friends. Or a different serpent saying, Gwyn wasn't cool at all. He was really rude. Kill his friends. The fun of the game comes from figuring out a complete picture of what you can find, but there isn't really a narrative happening for most of it. The player isn't really given a chance to interact with the important events in this world. They read just picking up the pieces of stuff that already happened. In comparison to Dark Souls, who does something really interesting. You get a cool metaphorical sequence in the opening where a Darkseid-branded character's family melts away under the weight of the curse, making you live so long you forget everything. Already we given our first proper theme, and it works on both the personal and world level in that the world is making less and less sense because things are falling away, which, by the way, coincides really well with the fact the world design is like that. The story itself, to start with, is self-consciously a rehash of the previous game. The Emerald Herald tells you you need to face thinking, and to do that you need some big souls. Oh, cool. Thanks. Nice one. So you do that. Along the way, you find areas and bosses strangely evocative of the previous ones. Najkai, shall we say, Quillag adjacent. Shall Quililzilzizi, I say, Fintia, The gutter is very Blightowny, and so on. There's a lot of parallels, but it's never quite made clear that you re explicitly in the same world as Lord Wren, or at least not the same places. There's just a subtle thing in the back of your head about how this all seems oddly familiar. So you kill all the enemies, and on the way there are these occasional locked doors. There's no explicit sense that you're missing any large areas. All the paths terminate in dead ends or weird shrines with the primal bonfires in them. The game is pretty long just accounting for these 4 paths. So when you go to Castle Drangleic, you get the sense this really is the end game. You progress all the way through the castle to the shrine beneath, and then through the grave of saints. There's a real sense of build-up. Then you fight Velstead, who's guarding the door to Vendrick. After beating him, you finally go to meet your presumably final opponent, the same final opponents you fought in Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 1, the corrupted king of the world you've been walking through. But instead, this happens. Vendrick is a shadow of the man talked about in the lore and by the characters that remember him. He, like the fate of the rest of the undead, like the player's character will eventually become, has lost his mind. You don't have to fight Vendrick at all. He's not your enemy. He's just a man who lost his way and everything else with it. It's hard to relate how touching this is. The game genuinely feels like it was building to their very final confrontation. It's a game about a man who's lost his way, and he's trying to find his way back. It was building to their very final confrontation. The room is built to have a dramatic passage down steps similar to the lead-up to Gwyn, and it's built so that the camera naturally passes through it to reveal what Vendrick has become. I feel bad for spoiling it for people who haven't experienced the game yet, but this moment is pivotal to what makes the story interesting. You rebuilt up for the traditional Souls game encounter with a fallen king, and instead you refaced with a thing to whom it doesn't even occur to fight you anymore, shambling around almost naked. You just have to pick up the king's ring, which unlocks the final areas and allows you to head to Aldia, Skeep, and eventually meet the ancient dragon who's also not interested in fighting you. He gives you the Ashen Mist Heart, which lets you journey into the memories of gents from the old war Vendrick fought. You get to see a lot of the damage that you encounter in the main path happening. It's really neat. Killing the Giant Lord lets you face Nashandra, Vendrick's queen, at the Throne of Want. Killing her nets you precisely one ending. Your character sits on the throne, presumably having become the new king, and then the credits play. But instead of resetting the game, it just carries on. You re-put back in the world. The game deliberately undercuts its story. You win, but what do you win? Kingship over awning world. The chance to sit in a chair. Only one character in the game even recognizes you as the new king, Shalkuar, the seemingly immortal cat who also knows most of the rest of the lore about the other bosses. If you want to, you can use bonfire ascetics to refight old bosses or refresh enemies if you exhaust them, or you can completely kill all even the Emerald Herald. You can make the world of Dark Souls too completely empty of people and monsters. The only way to access New Game Plus is to sit at a bonfire and deliberately choose to start it all over again. I like these choices because they hammer home the hopelessness of the Dark Souls story that was there in 1, but undercut by the fact no matter what ending you got, you just started at the beginning again. Dark Souls 2 forces you to contemplate how little you've really achieved with all these deaths, and then forces you to decide when it's time to do it all again. Ultimately, Dark Souls 2 is about cycles. The story is deliberately evocative of the previous game, exploring the empire of a king who fell, but with an explicit focus on how this has all happened before, and not just coincidentally. Perhaps it's something we're doomed to keep doing. Humanity, perhaps unable to ever fully escape its own nature, is repeating its mistakes over and over. For a game with so much architecture and character in so many of its designs, the best piece of imagery is the simplest one, the symbol of the dark sign. It's a loop, a circle, reflecting the way the undead return to life no matter what, continuing even after they lose their minds. Humanity itself is trapped in this loop. The story is much more for the player than in the previous game. It's a story in which the player is expected to contemplate their own actions instead of those of others, and recognize that the problem here is the mistakes of the king or his people, but that people as a whole were unable to escape the mistakes that happened in Dark Souls 1. But what's even better is how it makes sure to tell you this isn't just on repeat. No, the story of Dark Souls 1 has happened maybe countless times, so many you don't know, and will never fully comprehend it. In a prison cell in the Lost Bastille is a man made of stone. If you unfreeze him, he refers to himself as Strayed of Olafis. Olafis was a kingdom where Drangleic now stands, untold generations ago, so long ago that no one but Strayed and the descriptions of spells and items invented by him or belonging to him even mention it. In Dark Souls 1, all the various areas and people and their stories and what happened can be pieced together quite meticulously. You can, with enough work, put together a complete universe out of the facts. In Dark Souls 2, an entire civilization can be so utterly lost that only one man even knows its name. Who knows how many empires rose and fell between Olafis and Drangleic or Lordran and Drangleic, but pieces of them lay scattered everywhere, decayed colossal wrecks, each with their own rise to power and their own mad kings and their own undead curse rending them apart. The forest of fallen giants is Vendrick's doing, but Earthen Peak, the old Iron Keep. These places rose and fell on their own terms. The Dulk, which we'll get to later, each covers its own completely separate tale of a kingdom that rose and fell in roughly the same area. What's compelling about this is that it's more bizarre, more unexplained, and more human. People in the Souls universe are victims of a history they might never be able to learn. The story is about being lost in a confusing maze you can never fully understand, a feeling strengthened by the nightmarish of the actual physical world. Quelaag alone was simply a sad story about a woman transformed into a demon by an attempt to create more life, but now she's contextualized as a victim of a far deeper problem that mankind is having trouble escaping, because no matter what, it seems to keep happening over and over. Something really cool and kind of subtle is hidden in the basement of Majula. Down, hidden in the dirt, so small not many people notice, is a small, fractured piece of the Lord Vessel from the first game. This is the best expression of what Dark Souls 2 is doing with its story. It's interested in telling a story about being unable to fully piece together what's happening, as the character loses their minds in a doomed world of destroyed statues. Your character doesn't even know what a Lord Vessel is. To them, this is nothing, just a thing lying in the dust. It also represents the developers' attempts to do their own thing and move on by reducing an iconic part of the previous game to a piece of rubble in a basement. For me, the weakest parts of the previous games is when I got handed a whole heap of names, roles, and backstory. Demon's Souls did this, too, by just listing a bunch of people who went into the fog. I could just find those people and learn about them manually, but instead, the first games open with a needless roll call and a story about a fight with dragons that doesn't really tell me anything. The guys I'm going to kill killed a bunch of dragons a long time ago, and that's important because one flaw in the themes of Dark Souls was, for all its criticisms of the world Gwyn had built, an awful lot of time was dedicated to his kingdom, to exploring its majesty, and even when you darken Anor Londo, you still find yourself compelled to look upon his works and despair. Dark Souls 2 does the most compelling and interesting thing it could possibly do with the story of Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, Master of Anor Londo, King of Lordran. It asks, who? I don't even think he's mentioned by name at all. Gwyn may well have been a good and mighty king, but the lone and level sands stretch far away, and he is gone. The paranoid king who had strayed petrified is gone, the king of Lordran is gone, and the king of Drangleic is gone, but his burnt-out husk still walks the earth yet, and we remember him for now. I think a lot of people wanted a story with the exact type of intricacies of the previous game. I can see wanting that and understand being disappointed, but I prefer the lonesomeness and the unsolvable puzzle given off a world where the weight of time has dissolved away most of history, and even the physical world twists into itself in impossible ways, and a sea peaks can give way to the flames of chaos. It's maddening and majestic at the same time in a way that no concretely designed physical world can ever be. This is imagery. This is visual metaphor. There's doubtless plenty of theory crafting in Soul's lore circles about who the woman with the spinning wheel is when you, retold everything you need to know in just how she's presented here. She's deliberately evocative of the fortune-telling spirits with spinning wheels that exist seemingly throughout human mythology and folklore. More specifically, this character appears to be a reference to one of the most popular portrayals of this type of character in film history, the one that appears in Akira Kurosawa. Throne of Blood, also known as Spiderweb Castle. Throne of Blood is an adaptation of Macbeth. In case you haven't heard of Macbeth, about a happy-go-lucky guy whose destiny is to become king, but it turns out being the king isn't all it's cracked up to be. Spiderweb Castle, interestingly enough, right before the character who say reference to Spiderweb Castle, just to make sure you know they get it, they've just put a spider right there. The appearance of a character seemingly straight out of this film, a film about the darkness befalling people whose destiny is to rule, is a better piece of storytelling than all the item descriptions and all the loot drops in the world. But because it relieves on understanding of imagery outside of video games and visual storytelling, none of this information can be found on any wiki about the story of the Souls series. In a way, the story of Dark Souls 2 is the ultimate in nerd horror. It tells a story of a universe it's impossible to build a comprehensive fucking wiki about. And to nerds, That's the scariest thing there is. This opening proceeds into a series of destroyed castles, ruined thrones, mad, dead kings. When you finally get your own throne, there's a worrying ambivalence to it. The best Dark Souls own could muster was having sad music play over the last boss, and if you look at Jimmy's pants it tells you how bad he was when he was a kid. Dark Souls 2 puts you into the role of the last boss, becoming patriarch of a world on its way to its doom, ultimately failing to achieve anything. And it asks you how you feel about that and where you go from here. The pacing of Dark Souls wasn't great after the Lord Vessel, but it did a lot more with a lot less when it came to its plot. Its introductory video set up the world and the major players very efficiently. Efficient storytelling is being placed over good storytelling or even a good story. I think gamers on the whole are still kind of enamored with a Wikipedia-style approach to storytelling, where everything can be concretely pieced together in an objective narrative, when really I think there are a lot of other ways you can explore a story. The intro video to Dark Souls 2 shows the main character dropping into some kind of whirlpool because the old lady tells us we recursed and the only hope of a cure is to go to Drangleic for some reason. She actually says we'll have no idea why we re going to do any of the stuff we re about to do. This visual metaphor for falling into darkness, you know, the thing that going hollow does to your mind, is reduced to falling into some kind of whirlpool. A woman visually coded as having the power to see the future, predicting a horrible fate in which we do things without fully understanding their purpose because we lose our minds, is reduced to the old lady telling us to go to Drangleic for some reason. No wonder this critical approach to storytelling resulted in finding the story lacking. No, this is just an old lady telling us to do things for some reason. There's no nuance or meaning or cinematic language being utilized here. That level of understanding has no place in me nuanced critic of a video game. New Game Plus is the bad ending. You press a button and admit that all that's left is for everything to happen again. There's another ending, which came out when all the ducks had come out and also adds a new character. I think this aspect of the story is interesting in its own way, but I don't like how people use it as an excuse to criticize Dark Souls 2, pretending there wasn't enough a story in the initial release and this is an admission of that and they finally fixing it, or they repatching the story in post or something. There's plenty of story, but just not the kind everyone wanted. For me it was already complete in its incompleteness, but giving the player the option of getting an ending where they beat another boss and walk out is a nice little bonus. It's a nice extra little thing to give people, and that's all right. The Vcodec Dark Souls 2 is fantastic. Each one experiments with mechanics in cool and interesting ways I don't want to get too far into because we already pressed for time. Rest assured they all lengthy enough to feel like worthwhile additions. I'll rattle off the fun stuff I really liked. I like Broom Tower's verticality and the way you unlocked more access from the central hub once you got the key wedge thing. I like Crown of the Old Iron Kings gimmick of having the first boss and the Iron King himself be just to your left when you come in, and you can take a series of looping paths around to make the first boss visible, then go around again once the ice melts to gain access to more soldiers for the Old Iron King fight. You could find and build a little army to help you even out the odds, and that's really cool. I like the puzzles that require you to actually use a bow to progress. The Souls games, when it comes down to it, are something of an offshoot from Zelda and its attempt to bring some honest-to-God bow and arrow puzzles to the game. It was unexpected, but it fit together quite well. I like these coast goeys who look like phantoms you see online. It actually trips you up when you discover they real and they attack you. It makes for a cool fake-out I just spoiled for you, so I hope you already played this bit. Sin the Slumbering Dragon is a hard fight, but the first really fun fight with a dragon in basically any of these games for me personally, especially after the optional ancient dragon fight, which is honestly a chore. In many ways, the Dulk embodies Dark Souls 2 in microcosm, being willing to go all the way and experimenting with its mechanics to create new and unique areas, and in doing so, it also comes to embody the very best the Souls series has to offer as a whole. It's everything that I think I ever wanted from a Souls game, and it's part of Dark Souls 2, so Dark Souls 2 wins. Scholar of the First Sin is a second edition of Dark Souls 2 that came out nearly 2 years ago now. It bundled together the Dulks for the original release of the game, had some graphical and performance updates, and put the items that grant access to the Dulk in the world itself as things to find instead of items you simply start with if you owned the Dulk in the previous version. This version's really interesting. I'm not going to say good, interesting. Instead of a simple, slightly visually improved bundle, it actually dramatically changes most of the game. Almost all of the enemy encounters and placements have been altered, and the amount of enemies has overall increased massively. I've played Dark Souls 2 multiple times before playing this version, and I found it to be very different and much harder despite superficially being the same game. It's more frustrating too. A lot of people didn't like the amount of enemies you often fight at once in Dark Souls 2, something I didn't have a problem with in that game, but in this it's definitely difficult enough to be annoying even if you know how to deal with groups in this engine. Honestly, the game this reminds me of the most is Super Mario Bros. 2. The Japanese Mario 2 is like an optional harder Mario game, pushing the engine and player skill requirements to the absolute limit before it becomes unsellable as a consumer product. Heck, they didn't even bother selling it in the West for a reason. I'd call Scholar a pretty good game. Also call a place It's challenging, it's entertainingly funny in places, and it's a nice way of playing a game you love dearly in a new, remixed way. However, have to qualify calling it good. It's good only within the context of Dark Souls 2 already existing, of there being about a year of playing the original version to prepare for this one. I would not recommend this game to anyone as a first game in the series, which for some people this might have saddeningly been. It's for people who are die-hard fans of the series already, or even just fans of two specifically, and for those people, even when it's not fun, it's fun as an entertaining little experiment with a bunch of aspects of the game tweaked just enough. It feels almost like a ROM hack of Dark Souls 2 they made for fun, and for some people that might be a condemnation, especially considering it's the cost of a full-priced game. So I can't heartily recommend it. But the Soul games are quite difficult to recommend already. Something I like specifically is the entrance to the earthen peak from Harvest Valley. There's a couple of enemies in the original, but it seems quite underutilized, like it's a short, quick rush through an area that could be more fleshed out. In Scholar, it's significantly altered. There's way more enemies. It's way more difficult. There's purposeful traps for if you tree and run past, and it has more enemy types that appear in, like, 2 places in the original game, which is nice. There were also more hidey nights in general, which is great and something I wanted, and also they were way more aggressive. Some of them get up and go for you now, and that's a really cool thing that you just don't expect if you play the original, and that's really, really fun. Also, something I quite like about both games is that in each one, someone's credentials are called into question. In the original, in Heidi's Tower, the dragon rider looked like an idiot. There were no dragons anywhere for most of the game. Why is he called the dragon rider? What? That's ridiculous. The guy is obviously lying. But in Scholar, it's the dragon slayer just over the way from him who's clearly lying on his resume. There's a dragon right outside his fucking office. Don't get the Scholar edition unless you similarly really like 2 already, and don't approach it as its own game purse, but as another way of playing a game you already liked for what it was doing, and you'll probably have a good time. I honestly want to see more games like this. I would have liked a similar edition along these lines for every Souls game, to be honest. Wait. Hold on a second. Obviously, a lot of game criticism is based on subjective experience, which can't exactly be proven wrong, sadly, but that's not what I'm trying to do here. My aim as a critic is to try and find ways of looking at and analyzing games and their design that are useful and help informing better ideas of quality, but also to try and understand and explain why other people reacted differently. I've had some pushback from people on some of my long game analysis videos, usually by people who enjoyed a game I was being critical about, or didn't enjoy a game I liked, or who played the game a way I said was wrong and happened to like it. I in no way mean to diminish other people's experiences of a game. If you didn't like something, I can't reason you into liking it. My aim is to understand why people do or don't like something and learn from that and use the information in me work. I've gone on record as thinking the Souls games are all very good, but that doesn't make other people not liking them or not thinking that wrong. They were useful because you learn why people wouldn't enjoy something, and that's really helpful if you, for example, are interested in what makes a game fun to a lot of people, which is really financially lucrative nowadays. I feel the games got better at correcting the sort of problems that caused not a lot of people to enjoy them early on, at least without a lot of friction at the start, and somewhat interestingly, helped them go back and appreciate the previous ones. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, and in my opinion, every other game critic is stupid. Okay, I can't even make that joke here. You see, the overly negative critical response from Souls diehards in some spheres of the internet isn't even accurate to what most game critics said when the game first came out. On the whole, people loved it. The misgivings came specifically from folks like matthewmatosis, and the popularity of his video predicated centrally on how the game couldn't possibly be as good as the first because Miyazaki didn't make it, and locking on in some fights isn't a good idea, and the opening cutscene didn't talk about a war that already happened and has no effect on us as a player. Ignore how, in Dark Souls 2, there's a similar ancient war in the distant past, but you get to learn about it over the course of the game instead of a pre-rendered cutscene at the beginning, and then you get to actually go fight in it. Critics at the time of release liked it a lot, the exact same way critics liked Demon's Souls a lot back when this whole series was new and strange and not many people played or liked it. People who think about games a lot are more likely to easily get into a new experience than people who just play them as a hobby. Internet critics like Yahtzee wiped their ass all over various aspects of the games that would later say they loved when audiences started to get a hang of the games and it turned out they were talking bollocks. Fuck you, Demon's Souls. A challenge is own thing, but trying to break down a fucking cement wall with your forehead isn't a challenge, it's grounds for getting fucking sectioned. Demon's Souls is one of the most rewarding, challenging games ever to hit tips 3. It may not be for everyone, but I still urge everyone to at least try it. And GameSpot's 2009 Game of the Year is Demon's Souls. Demon's Souls is like nothing you've ever played. Do you hear that? It was the best and most innovative game of 2009. That's Kevin Van Flipping Ord. That's the thought criminal who was so wrong about Fallout 3 he was found dead in his cell last year next to an apology written in my blood. Even he has been on the ground floor of the Souls series since day one. It turns out that professional game critics err quite often more ahead of the curve than the average consumer or the not-to-be-rude fanboy types who will dismiss a sequel for being too different to the one they first fell in love with. Mainstream game critics can be wrong, but they've been consistently right about the Souls series from day one. It's only corners of the internet full of rose-tinted fanboyishness towards the first Dark Souls that result in the ridiculous treatment of the second game. When it comes down to it, Dark Souls was a fantastic game, even though it's flawed in a lot of ways that are so much more obvious now than ever. I think the sheer surprise of how good Dark Souls was after most people missed the boat on Demon's Souls made it a hard act to follow, and lots of fans got unrealistic expectations about it. The online response to Dark Souls 3 sounds overall lukewarm but positive, and I think that might be because, at least in regards to this one series, maybe not a couple others, people have cooled and learned to manage their expectations. I'm interested in finally getting to play it after working for so long on videos about the games that preceded it. I am a little worried that the fan reaction to some aspects of 2 made them walk back on the good ideas in an effort to be more like the first one, but I'm gonna play then judge it on its own merits as its own game before I really consider that. Though I, oh, I am too well, the bad, the 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 so do the go so no so no In the meantime, Dark Souls 2 is not perfect, but you can have a grand old time with it. The gameplay contains some of the tightest moments in the whole series and some really fun variations on the formula. It tells a story that, instead of redoing the original or trying to build on it in a straightforward way, self-consciously explores what it means to exist in a specific position in gaming culture and asks us what the things we desire from games say about us. I really enjoyed Dark Souls 2, and I think there's a lot of things that make it good, and if you didn't enjoy it, that's okay. Your different opinions and experiences are equally as valid, and I know we talk authoritatively sometimes, but I hope it's clear I'm just offering my opinion in a way I think is interesting or convincing, and it's okay to disagree with me. For now, Music, thanks so much for watching this really long addendum to a super long video. Making this kind of criticism takes a ridiculous amount of time and effort, and it always takes so much longer than I think it will, so I really would like to thank me patrons for keeping me in spaghetti and moisturizer while I work. In addition to the names going past the screen right now, I'd especially like to thank Gabriel Mann, Aislinn, Gedankte Kommissarteka, the Cameo, Joseph Grieco, David should be the loop should be the producer should be the save the loop so the deal the bow Colin tell tell Taylor 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 Leo Taylor 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 down Lily, the lovely, well, He's changed it again. A huge pair of blue spheres on a flaccid penis. He's spelt flaccid wrong now. Corwin Light Williams, Scene Kemp, Shadowbag, Findlay Bowick Copley, Morn Silverplatz Tunstrom. I hope we got that right. K. Plays Dote of Jeffrey Theobald, Tom Martell, Dipshit Chris, Scott Jerton, A Mysterious Benefactor, Lissy Roberts, Disciple, Torukan No 1, 3/5 of a Brain, Layer and Tacticos, Mackenzie Cockerill, Ash Stryker, Claw Sue Daniel Stewart, Anas, Casey Explosion, Young Cowrie, Clementine, Soul, Eric Hunter, Marco Shard, Jan Anders Bremer, Weebu Gaming, Gary Marshall, Aidan Bradley, Kugda Vivi, Graff and Blackpaw, Alexander Corbett, Samij, Luca Vives of Vivi, Swanson, Fully Automated Queer Gay Cuck Space Communism, Zachary Clark, Benjamin Davidson, J. Logabe, Hero War, Jason Walter, Paulo Wolf 98, Luke Gould, Kuchev, Faviv, Faviv, Fazavi, Savai, Vivio, Rio, Livizo, Sav, Savavio, Savavio, Pisavio, Vio, Vivo, Sav. Brio yo bombe vi bio view zo yo yo view zo yo ba view yo 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 po view zo yo zo po view view zio view zio view yo view zo view yo po view so show po bio view. Oh, zero, 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 you buy. Oh, zero, zero, you zero, 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 you do, you bow, deal, drill, zero, 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 have you, zero, zero, you zero, zero, you zero, you, why, oh, you, zero. If you've made it this far, you either listened to the credits like a true believer, or guessed correctly I'd put something after the credits and skipped ahead like a meanie. In any case, the time has come totally up the votes from the secret vote I held at the end of the Bloodborne video. Let's see which one won. Drumroll, please. Oh, I have to edit that in myself, don't I? Drumroll ding thud sigh. Fuck it. Deus Ex. Let's do that one. That. Whoa.